Hello, my name's Ian from IAB Tours, and today, in collaboration with Free Tours by Foot, I'm going to be taking you for a tour of Stratford-upon-Avon here in central England. Stratford is one of England's best preserved medieval market towns, a wealth of history, beautiful buildings and architecture from all kinds of periods, and of course it is world famous as the birthplace of none other than William Shakespeare, one of the most important literary figures in history. We're going to be looking at the Shakespeare links and exploring together all that this little town has to offer. So if you'd like to find out more about me, check out the links in the description below this video. You can find a link to my website and also to my social media channels there. And if you enjoy this tour and you'd like to treat your guide to a coffee or a pint, you can find a link in the description to do that too. So without further ado, why don't we get started? And in the words of William Shakespeare himself in his play The Comedy of Errors, will you not walk with me about the town? We begin our tour by walking across the River Avon and then along the banks of the river, where we'll make stops at the Royal Shakespeare Theatre and then continue to Holy Trinity Church, where the great bard and his family were laid to rest. Next, we'll stroll through the town's historic centre, passing by many of its treasured timber-framed homes and civic buildings, including Shakespeare's boyhood school. And finally, we end our tour at the birthplace of William Shakespeare. There's plenty more to see in between, so let's get started. And if you enjoyed this tour, check out some of my other tours here on the Free Tours by Foot channel, including the tour that I did in Oxford. We begin our tour today crossing the River Avon in towards the town centre of Stratford. There are two bridges here across the river, and we're going to cross the newer of them, which was built in 1826. The older bridge, the stone bridge, is the one we can see with the modern traffic going across it. But actually, this is a very old bridge. It was constructed originally in the year 1492. Now, we all know that in 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail to discover the New World. But here in Stratford, the date has a different significance, and that's because it was when the first stone bridge was built over the River Avon, funded by a very wealthy Stratford man by the name of Sir Hugh Clopton, and it's called the Clopton Bridge in his honour. So the bridge we're actually walking across these days is a pedestrian bridge, but it was originally built for what was known as the Stratford Tramway. The Stratford Tramway was an early form of railway that was used to bring goods to Stratford from the surrounding area, because Stratford was an important market town, an important trading centre here on the River Avon in the heart of England. And the Stratford Tramway was not a tramway in the sense that we might think of today. It was before the age of steam. It was a horse-drawn tramway bringing agricultural products and stone from the surrounding area to Stratford, and bringing products that would be taken by boat on the newly built canals in the 1820s northwards to the industrial cities like Birmingham and Coventry. So here is a beautiful view of the Avon with the large building there. We're going to see it much more closely in a little while. That is the Royal Shakespeare Theatre, and as you can see, the river very popular for boating, and it also has a large population of waterfowl, swans, geese, ducks, and they nest on the islands, the little islands here in the Avon. They are a nature reserve. So all of this transportation, the boats, the tramway, that was because 200 years ago this area would have been very, very different. Nowadays it's full of visitors enjoying parks and gardens and the attractions that can be found here. Back then it was an area of warehouses and factories, an industrial area, a transshipment point for goods from this region between the tramway, between the River Avon, and between the man-made canal network that was so important for moving goods around England at that time, in the days before modern transportation like roads and rail. We have one reminder of that really here, which is this particular building, which is a wooden framed warehouse style building that has been renovated, and it now contains a small theatre, a restaurant and a bar. Cox's Yard it is called. Stratford is a very, very popular town with visitors, and all year round they come here to visit the theatre, to visit the Shakespeare sites, and just to enjoy the atmosphere of an English market town in this great riverside location. And on a summer's day like today, you can see blue sky, not a cloud in the sky really. It's a great day for us to be here exploring the town, and we couldn't have made a better choice of days to come here and do this tour. So here is one of the wagons that remains from this horse-drawn tramway. You can see here it says Thomas Hutchings Newbold Lime Works. So they were bringing rocks and limestone from quarries to the south of here, loading them onto boats to take them where they were needed. And this is the kind of wagon that the horses would be pulling as it went along. It was not really used for very long, because within about 30 years of the tramway opening, steam railways had come to Stratford, and so they took over all of the long distance transportation really from that tramway system. Well, we have been walking for a few minutes in Stratford, so I think it's really high time that we paid our respects and said hello to Stratford's most famous son. And here is the most prominent statue and memorial to William Shakespeare that we have in Stratford. Not from his lifetime. Stratford lived from 1564 to 1616. Born and died here in his hometown of Stratford. This is a 19th century statue donated to Stratford by Lord Gower, which is why it is called the Gower Memorial. So there sits William Shakespeare on a plinth. And around him, I want to show you the characters that are here, because they represent different aspects of the plays that Shakespeare wrote. They're characters from his plays. So on this side we have Prince Hal with his crown there. He went on to become Henry V, one of our great military heroes of medieval England, and a very popular play, Henry V, by Shakespeare. So that tells us that Shakespeare wrote history plays. And over this side we have a character who was a good friend of Prince Hal when he was a young man, a very fine comic character by the name of Sir John Falstaff. And John Falstaff represents comedy, so Shakespeare wrote a number of comedies, and a lot of them are still to this day very, very entertaining, and a lot of the humour does still work quite well. Not so much the contemporary references, but there we go. So on this side, Lady Macbeth, a very tragic character, and you can see here, as she does many times in the play Macbeth, she's washing her hands, something that we've all had to do in the last couple of years many times. Lady Macbeth representing tragedy. And finally, let's take a look at the front of him, although we get a nice shot of him from the side actually. This is Hamlet, one of Shakespeare's most famous characters of all, and Hamlet is representing philosophy, deep thought, the fact that Shakespeare is addressing some quite important questions of life, death and everything in between in his plays. So the Gower Memorial really represents a lot of important things about Shakespeare, not just the fact that he was born in Stratford, but the things that he wrote that live on to this day. Now we're standing here next to what is known as the Canal Basin. These days the canal boats are all really for leisure purposes. People can moor their canal boats here. There are also shops and bars and cafes on boats, and a floating restaurant that you can take in the evenings as well in Stratford. But again, 200 years ago, this would have been an area of activity, of warehouses, of small factories and businesses, very, very different from today. This canal runs up northwards and it connects the River Avon with the city of Birmingham, which is not too far away. It takes about 45 minutes by car, but by canal boat it would have taken a lot longer 200 years ago because they'd have been pulled by horses. And Birmingham is on a plateau and Stratford in a valley, so there are a lot of locks to get through. Would have probably taken a couple of days to get there. And here by the canal we have beautiful gardens. Just so many attempts have been made to make this a really pleasant and attractive location for the visitors who come here. So we've crossed the Avon and we are going to be heading towards the town, because whenever people came into Stratford, they would come, if they were coming from the south, they'd come across the bridge and then they would head on into the town. Most people, certainly in the time of Shakespeare or even before that in medieval times, would have been coming here because Stratford was a market town. So they'd have been heading on up Bridge Street, and that's where they'd have been able to find the markets to sell whatever goods it was that they were bringing, whether it was goods that they'd made, if they were craftsmen, or products from their farms and small holdings to the south of here. Oh, so one of the things we can see in Stratford, it really does in the summertime pick up, and it's so good to be here now on a time when we have a lot of nice things open again for visitors, including the big wheel where you can get a lovely view of Stratford and more importantly of the surrounding countryside from the air. People can take out boats onto the river, rowing boats, motorboats, or sit back and enjoy a guided cruise. So all kinds of things here for visitors to enjoy here on the riverside. And there are always musicians and people doing some kind of performance. So a little bit of the Undertones, Teenage Kicks. I have to say, compared to many places I've been, actually the buskers in Stratford are usually of a reasonably good quality. Of course, you get buskers with music, you get dance, you also get people performing little scenes and sonnets of Shakespeare as well in the parks, especially at the height of summer. There's so much performance and celebration of that heritage here. So one of the things you can see is that this part of the town is very flat and is very much at quite a level with the river. And what that meant, and what it still means to this day, is that it is quite susceptible to flooding. The original settlement of Stratford from over 1,000 years ago was actually here, close to the river, where we're going to be a little bit later at the church mainly. But it was getting flooded a lot, and so when Stratford got a charter from the king to hold a market in 1196, King Richard I, Richard the Lionheart was the king at that time, they decided to build a new laid out town on a little hill slightly further away from the river so it wouldn't be flooding, which is why all of the streets you see here, Bridge Street we saw here, Sheep Street, guess what kind of products they sold on there, sheep and wool, sloping slightly uphill. The modern centre of the town is this town from the 12th century that was laid out on the higher ground. Oh, we got another busker. A beautiful fountain here, and this fountain was created in 1996 to celebrate 800 years of Stratford being a market town, getting that market charter from King Richard I. And it features the symbol of the town, which are swans. Well, straight ahead of us is a building we saw from the bridge. This is the RSC. You can probably see the letters emblazoned on the glass of the front of the building there. The Royal Shakespeare Company. And the building is the Royal Shakespeare Theatre. And there have been 3 theatres on this site, all of which are kind of still here. We'll see the original one shortly. But what we have on this side is a shell, the outer facade of the building. And this is the theatre that was built in the late 1920s. The original theatre was heavily damaged by fire in 1926, and so they built a new theatre to replace it, a larger one. But that again started to show its age, and in the early years of this century they decided to replace it with a modern one, but they used the shell of the building, they kept it as it was, and inside it they built a modern version of the theatre with lots of more visitor facilities, new cafes, restaurants, better facilities for the theatre company, and this particular tower that stretches up as a visual feature of the new theatre. Now, the Royal Shakespeare Company is still one of the most important stages in the English language theatre, really. If you name any top English actor or actress of the last 100 years, the chances are they will have been on stage there. And you can come here in the season and see leading actors, people of the calibre of Patrick Stewart, Sir Ian McKellen, Dame Judi Dench. These are the kinds of people who in more recent times have been performing here, and the Royal Shakespeare Company is still a major landmark in the career progression of anyone who wants to class themselves as a leading actor. The actual theatre company is based in a building across the road from the theatre. So this we see was the original kind of place where they stored all their equipment. The huge door in the centre, you have to imagine they're bringing the stage decorations and all the equipment out of there to take over to the theatre to put on the stage. And the original Shakespeare Theatre in Stratford was not built until over 250 years after Shakespeare's death. Better late than never though, and here it is. It's called the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre. The land and the money was donated by a very wealthy local businessman, the owner of a brewery called Charles Flowers. And the Shakespeare Theatre was opened in 1885. And that was the main theatre here, the only theatre really, until 1926 with the fire, which gutted the interior. And so that was when the 1920s theatre was built. In the 1980s, this building, which had been used inside for storage and those kinds of things, was restored, and a small theatre was created in there as an extra space for smaller productions. And it was named the Swan Theatre in honour of the symbol of the town, but also in honour of Shakespeare, who was referred to by his contemporary Ben Jonson as the Swan of Avon. Some very typical English features here. A red post box and a red phone box next to one another. All of the mailboxes in England, the post boxes, they have the abbreviation representing the monarch at the time they're installed. In this case, VR, so the V stands for Victoria. So we know this has been installed since at least 1901, with the phone box next to it. And the phone box design, that very typical famous English thing, was by a man named Giles Gilbert Scott. And the architect of the 1920s theatre, just behind it, was actually his niece, Elizabeth Scott. So a whole family of very well-known architects working from the middle of the 19th century until right into the 20th century, creating many iconic buildings and structures around England. So here we get a very, very nice view of that memorial theatre, the Swan now as it is today, from the 1880s. And opposite one of Stratford's better known hotels, the Arden Hotel, and the name is a reference to the Forest of Arden, which is an area of hillsides and woodlands to the north of Stratford. William Shakespeare's mother was called Mary Arden, so she grew up from that area, and he uses the Forest of Arden as a setting in a number of his plays and poems as well. Now, one of the things that happens when you have somebody famous like Shakespeare is you get a lot of gifts and donations and tributes being paid. And one of the ways they did that in Stratford was that cities and countries donated decorated lampposts over the years. Not all decorated, some of them just have the flag on them. In this case, we have a particularly fine one though, with the ass and the musician, and this was donated by, and the owl on the top, donated by the State of Israel. And every year there is a huge Shakespeare birthday celebration. The closest weekend to the 23rd of April, which is the birth and death date of William Shakespeare. So he died on his 52nd birthday, and there's a huge celebration in the town and a big parade with music and ceremony and all kinds of events going on, and it's one of the biggest events on the town's calendar. Now, one of the questions that is very important on the lips of actors and visitors alike when they come to the theatre is, where do I go afterwards to get a drink? And the most popular pub with actors over many years has been this one. You can see a part of the sign, and it's universally known as the Dirty Duck. But actually that started life as a nickname, because the pub is not actually called the Dirty Duck. The one side of the pub sign tells us it's the Dirty Duck, but that was a nickname based on its actual name, which is the Black Swan, as you can see on the other side of the sign. And the nickname was given to the pub originally by American servicemen who were stationed in this area during and after World War II. And it kind of stuck as a really kind of unusual and silly name. And if you ever get the chance to go inside the Dirty Duck, you will see lots of photographs of famous actors having a drink in there. A lot of them are autographed and still known as the Actors Pub to this day. So we're going to go and have a little walk right along the side of the Avon now. As soon as it's safe to do so. I see a number of swans, a number of people enjoying the river on boats of various kinds. And a huge area of public park and recreation grounds on the other side of the river, hugely popular with visitors as well. Now, I mentioned that the Royal Shakespeare Theatre was having a new modern theatre built, and of course that took some time. It took several years, and well, you don't just close down Shakespeare performances in Shakespeare's hometown for several years. You have to find a solution. And the solution that the Royal Shakespeare Company found was to build a temporary theatre. And the temporary theatre they built is housed in the brown building that we can see here, that looks very industrial. But actually inside it was a very modern, perfectly good theatre for putting on those performances. The idea was that it's a temporary building, we don't need to worry too much about what it looks like on the outside. The idea was that it would be removed when the new theatre was complete. But that as yet hasn't happened, because they decided that actually having an extra big space like that, where they could put a second large auditorium and have extra rehearsal spaces and administrative space for educational programs that they're involved with, that would be a good idea. So as things stand, the temporary building, we have to kind of put that word temporary in the proverbial inverted commas and air quotes around it, which you won't be able to see because I'm not on the screen, but I'm putting air quotes around that word for you because it doesn't look like it's actually going to end up being temporary at all. Now, the gardens we're in are owned by the Royal Shakespeare Theatre. They're called the RST Gardens, and they provide a lovely haven, bit of peace and quiet away from the hustle and bustle of the town centre and all of the things that are here for visitors to enjoy along the riverside. A place where people can come and relax, and a lot of people come here to walk their dogs and for their kids, with their kids, and for a picnic. Some great decoration on the wall here of showing some scenes from plays in recent years at the Royal Shakespeare Theatre. So we can see just really some of the bringing to life Shakespeare's plays in different kinds of settings, and really beautiful photographs that they've captured here to display within the park. From time to time they do have outdoor performances here, and outdoor Shakespeare is quite a popular thing in England. Many people, there are touring companies, and they will go to a local park or a stately home, a botanical garden, and you will go with your picnic chair, your garden chair, your fold-up chair, and you will take a picnic and a drink, a bottle of wine, whatever you want to, and you'll set up and you will sit in the idyllic setting and you will enjoy an outdoor performance of Shakespeare. Because of course, in England, the weather is always perfect for doing that. You never have to take a waterproof coat and worry whether it's going to be too cold by the middle of the evening to watch the play. Yes, outdoor Shakespeare is beautiful when you have the right weather for it. It can sometimes be an interesting thing to do. Here we see another view of the river. And you hear the bird song as well. See really how quickly we've gone from that bustling riverside area with all the visitors, with all the buskers and the things that are going on there. Just a few minutes walk and you're in this really tranquil spot that people can come to enjoy. And really we're actually here in the area where the first settlement of Stratford would have been, because the original settlement here grew up around a medieval monastery which dates back to the 9th century. So Stratford has a really long history as a settlement. And small settlement grew up here around the monastery, and the parish church, which we're going to see in a couple of minutes, was based on the original location of the monastery church. The street that runs from this part of Stratford by the river up to the centre of the town is called Old Town. Not Old Town Road or Old Town Lane or anything like that. It is just called Old Town. And Holy Trinity Church, the parish church of Stratford for over 1,000 years, has the great address 1 Old Town. So it really tells us where Stratford began, just in its postal address. So here we're stepping into the churchyard of Holy Trinity. And this is where the original medieval monastery would have been, and it subsequently became the parish church of Stratford, and has this beautiful avenue of lime trees planted in quite recent times and sponsored by local families and members of the church and so on. Really a beautiful way to approach the church, and we are going to step off it so that we can actually have a good view of the church itself. Most of what we see in the fabric of the church today was constructed between the 12th and the 15th centuries, added to over the years, as you can imagine, by various wealthy local people. And here we've got a nice view. The sun is not ideally positioned, but we'll find a better view as well in a couple of minutes. And Holy Trinity, one of the finest examples of a town parish church that you can find anywhere in England. A beautiful, beautiful church. And it gives you an idea of the fact that Stratford was a prosperous market town. There's sometimes this idea that William Shakespeare came from, a little tiny place with a one-horse town. He was a real hick from the middle of nowhere. But that's not really true. He came from a middle-class background, and Stratford was a wealthy and prosperous market town with lots of trade links to other cities, including London. So, this was quite a successful town in many ways, 500-600 years ago, and that's reflected, I think, in the grandeur of its medieval parish church. Now, this parish church is also where William Shakespeare is buried, and the windows in front of us. On the other side of those is the main altar, so the very front of the church and the main altar, and just in front of the main altar on the ground are a number of slabs which are gravestones, tombstones, which is where William Shakespeare and various members of his family are buried. And Shakespeare was a very wealthy man in his own lifetime, and he paid a handsome fee to the church for the privilege of being buried in that number one location for him and his family, right next to the high altar. There were people already buried there, but just like today, if you have money, you can cut a few corners and get things done. So they dug them up and freed up the space for new tombs, and those new tombs were those of Shakespeare and a number of members of his family. Right by the river again. Now, a lovely view of the church and the east window here with the altar just on the opposite side. So, who were Shakespeare's family? Well, his wife was a woman by the name of Anne Hathaway, just like the modern actress, same name. Anne Hathaway was from a village just outside Stratford, although these days really Shottery, where she came from, is being incorporated into the larger town, which these days has about 28,000 inhabitants. And they married when William Shakespeare was just 18 and Anne was 26. So he married a young woman 8 years older than he was, and we presume for the first years of their marriage they would have lived at home with the Shakespeare family. We don't really know what happened to him then until he crops up in London as an actor and a playwright and a co-owner of a theatre. What we do know is that William and Anne had 3 children in total. The first of them was a daughter by the name of Susanna, and Susanna was born just 6 months after they were married. So perhaps get the idea that the marriage might have been a little bit rushed. And following Susanna came 2 further children, twins, a boy and a girl. The boy was named Hamnet. Careful, not Hamlet like the play, this is Hamnet with an N. And his twin sister Hamnet was called Judith. And unfortunately, Hamnet died at the age of 11. And that was, as you can imagine, a very traumatic event in William Shakespeare's life. He wrote a lot of his most tragic and soul-searching work in the years immediately following the death of his young son. As you can imagine, he was working through these very tough things in his own life, and he used his writing as a way of doing that, as I think many artists and writers and musicians and so on have done through the years and the centuries. Nothing unusual about that, I don't really think. And so the two daughters made it to adulthood. Judith Shakespeare, Judith did not have a particularly smooth relationship with her dad, mainly because of her choice of partner. Judith Shakespeare chose to marry someone with a terrible reputation in the town, a man by the name of Thomas Quiney, who was a wine dealer, but local gossip said that he drank more than he ever sold. He was a notorious womanizer and gambler and drinker, and Shakespeare did not want his daughter to marry such a man. But Judith said, "Sorry, Dad, I love him, I'm going to marry him." And William Shakespeare's response was to say, "Well, okay, I can't stop you, but you marry him, we have no further contact, and you inherit nothing of my wealth." And that is exactly what happened. The older daughter, Susanna, in many ways was Shakespeare's pride and joy, because her choice of husband was a friend of his, a very highly respected doctor and physician of the town, who also cared for lots of prominent people in the local region. So he would often be riding out to country estates and castles and so on, treating very wealthy sick people, or very sick wealthy people, take your pick. And his name was Dr. John Hall, and he built himself a house when he married Susanna Shakespeare, and here it is. This is the house that John Hall built, the brown house ahead of us, surrounded by the trees at the front. So this is a very, very typical house of the very early 17th century, timber framed construction, and it is a great example of the kind of house that a wealthy person like a doctor would have had at that time. And these days it's a museum. It's about sort of the life of the middle classes at that time, about the history of medicine, particularly the medicine at the time of Shakespeare and of Dr. John Hall. And in the garden behind the house are particularly all kinds of healing plants and herbs, because Dr. Hall wrote a book about medicine that was used as a textbook for many years by medical students, and that included a lot of descriptions of the medicinal value of different plants, and so that's why they converted the garden into sort of a living museum, if you like. So we're coming from really the medieval Stratford and Tudor Stratford. So Tudor, we're referring to mainly the late 15th to the very early 17th centuries, so the time of Shakespeare, when the Tudor monarchs of England were on the throne. But here we have a very different style of architecture, 18th, early 19th century. The style we call Georgian, because during that time we had a succession of kings. They were all called George, so we refer to that as the Georgian era. And that was a time again when Stratford was still quite a prosperous place. It was still a trading centre, an important market centre, and it was also becoming a visitor destination, as well as people started to have an interest in coming to visit the home of William Shakespeare. So the building on the end is a private school, for example, and the building on the other side is a former school, but these days it is an external department of the University of Birmingham. So just to the north of here, the biggest city is Birmingham, and the University of Birmingham, their Department of English, they have a department here specifically for the study of Shakespeare and his contemporaries, and that is housed within this particular building. although we're seeing quite a bit of 18th and 19th century architecture, the street pattern has remained unchanged largely for around the last 700 years or so. So there were much older buildings here, and we can see on this side some of these buildings have been partially reconstructed, but we still have the original timber framed construction forms a part the essential structure of many of these houses. And actually a lot of the more modern buildings in Stratford as well, if you were to look behind the brick or the stone facades, you would find that they were based on a much older timber framed building. Okay, so here we have a pub. It's quite hot today, but we're not going to go in for a drink just yet. We'll do that after the tour maybe. You can see that the rear part of this pub really quite, you can see how old these beams are from holding the weight of the building over centuries, 600 years or so. But these beams of English oak are still withstanding that. But you have to keep them renovated and maintained. This is a pub that has been here for at least 500 years. It's called the Windmill. And what we know is that for the last few years of William Shakespeare's life, when he was living back in Stratford, he moved back from London, this would have been his local pub. He lived just up the road from here. Did William Shakespeare ever drink in this pub? We don't know for sure, but well, if he was going to come for a drink at that time in a pub we know was there, this could well have been the one. Now in modern times, Stratford is administratively the centre not only for the town itself, so you have the Stratford-upon-Avon Town Council, you also have a district council, which is the rural area around the villages in the area of Stratford, and this is the headquarters, the district council building, dating back to the 19th century. For some reason that nobody has ever been able to explain, the town is called Stratford-upon-Avon, but the district around it is called Stratford-on-Avon. Now, I don't know why. Nobody seems to know why. I'm going to cross slightly and hopefully walk in the middle of the road for a moment, just so I can show you one of the finest, best preserved rows of English timber-framed cottages. These are original cottages that date back to around 1470. Okay, so they are around 550 years old, and they were built by the town of Stratford at that time to be homes for needy and elderly residents of the town who could not afford to get a place under their own resources. And today they still fulfill a similar function in that they are retirement homes. So elderly people of the town of Stratford still live in these 500-year-old buildings. The buildings are original. The tenants have changed. They're not that quite that elderly. So I said that these cottages were built by the town council of Stratford at that time, which was called the Guild. And adjoining the buildings, the slightly taller building on the end, the two-storey building, this is the Guild Hall. So this is where the Stratford Town Council would have met. And they built it in the 14th century originally, and downstairs was the public area where the council meetings would have been taking place. There are also some side rooms where their officers would have been and their treasury and so on. It's also where there would have been public entertainments. We know from archives that they paid actors and musicians to come and perform here. Might well have been the first place that William Shakespeare ever saw theatre, because his father was a member of the town council. As a wealthy businessman of Stratford, he was on the town council, twice the mayor. So he would have definitely been very involved with this building, and his son William is likely to have been spending quite a bit of time when he was young in the upper floor, because that was the Stratford-upon-Avon Grammar School, founded by the guild so that their sons, so the sons of the prominent families in the town, were able to get a good education to prepare them for business and for a life maybe in the law or something like that, or as diplomats or whatever it might have been. And for many years this remained the School of Stratford. There is still a school at the back of it, the modern Stratford School. And until about 15 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, this building still belonged to the school. The upstairs room was a classroom, and the downstairs was the school library. Nowadays, it has been redeveloped into a place that visitors can go. They have fantastic exhibitions and sort of a recreation of a classroom from the time of Shakespeare and so on. Really is a very interesting place to visit if you get the chance. Now, like everything else, or like most areas of life in medieval times, running the local government had a religious element, and so the guild had its own chapel, the guild chapel here, where they would have had their ceremonial events and their religious services. So this street was really all about the medieval government of Stratford and what they were doing in the town. It was also where some of the wealthiest people lived, including our man William Shakespeare himself, because when he'd become very wealthy and successful in the London theatre world, Shakespeare bought himself the nicest private house in Stratford. It was called New Place, and he lived there the last years of his life with his wife Anne, who outlived him. Despite being older than him, she outlived him by several years. But of New Place, unfortunately, nothing remains. A subsequent owner in the 18th century got so sick of people wanting to see Shakespeare's house and Shakespeare's garden. He also had a dispute with the local authorities. The nature of that dispute was that they believed he should pay them some taxes, and he didn't think so. And so he decided to leave Stratford and to get his revenge on the town by tearing down New Place, which is why to this day all we can visit of New Place here with Shakespeare's coat of arms over the gate is the garden and what archaeological excavations have found of the outline of the house that originally stood there. We do have drawings of it, and what we know is that from the front, from the street, there would have been a building that looked a little bit like the one next door, although it was wider. But that was a very thin, that was almost an entranceway, a gatehouse, and it then led into an internal courtyard with the main house at the back and lands stretching for gardens, orchards and livestock all the way down practically to the river, really showing that Shakespeare was a very wealthy man and someone who used the money that he'd made to make wise investments. His father taught him well. His father, a very successful businessman in his own right. So this is what this street would once have looked like all the way along, with William Shakespeare's house and the other houses of wealthy, prominent members of the community. A series of houses here have been converted into one, the Shakespeare Hostelry, originally from the 19th century, this hotel. Nowadays it's a Mercure hotel, and it is one of the most popular hotels with visitors. A lot of the public areas like the bar and restaurants are in the main building, and they also have a newer block, a newer wing out the back as well. So really is a very traditional streetscape around here. But of course, timber frame buildings were in their day the most practical and most sensible local building material, because you had large forests of oak to the north of here and lots of craftsmen who were involved in building those kinds of structures. Brick in Shakespeare's day was a very luxurious material, which is why you find country houses of the very wealthy and the nobility of brick, whereas these days, of course, brick is a very common material. This is a 19th century brick and terracotta building. It's a bank, and the terracotta carvings show scenes from William Shakespeare's plays, and people started building in brick in the 19th century once brick could be produced on an industrial scale, because that drastically changed the price and the economic feasibility of building out of brick. Go ahead. And this was built in the early years of the 19th century as a bank. It still is a bank, the old bank. And here we have a picture of William Shakespeare, which is copied from the bust of him that is on the wall of Holy Trinity Church next to his tomb. So the chances are that is probably what he looked like, because the bust in the church was commissioned, paid for and approved by his wife and daughter and some of his colleagues. And so, of course, if you commission an artist to make a sculpture of your dead friend or relative, and they unveil it and you say, well, who's that guy meant to be? You're not going to pay. So the fact that the sculpture did get installed tells me that the likeness is believed to be what we think Shakespeare looked like. So here we have another building built of different materials, this time Cotswold stone. So the Cotswolds is a very beautiful area just to the south of here, famous for its limestone. And this is the town hall of the town of Stratford. So it's called the new town hall. The old town hall from the 17th century was blown up during the English Civil War. The two armies in the Civil War were the Parliamentary Army and the Royalist Army. One of the armies stored a whole load of gunpowder in the town hall of Stratford. Unfortunately, a spy from their enemies discovered what they'd done and set a light to it and blew up the gunpowder, the weapons that were in there, and the town hall alike. So we've got a couple of the most elaborate and beautiful remaining timber frame buildings in Stratford here. On the left hand side we have a building which is called the Garrick Inn. So it's a pub and a hotel. It's named after a man named David Garrick, a great Shakespearean actor and theatre owner of the 18th century. But it's actually been an inn for much longer than that, since for about 500 years. The interesting thing about these elaborately decorated timber frame buildings is that that was how you could show your wealth at that time, because the wood was very expensive, and what went between the wood, the plasterwork and everything, was cheaper. So the more wood you have, the more you're showing off you can afford to buy expensive materials. And we see that even more on the house next door. And what we see here as well, let me get a bit closer, is that you have carvings, elaborate carvings. So not only are you showing you can afford to buy lots of expensive material, you can pay an artist to carve it before it's installed as your home. And this house was the family home of a man who was almost an exact contemporary of William Shakespeare, who eventually took himself off to America, where he founded a library and a school, and with his legacy a college was founded. His name was John Harvard, founder of Harvard University, and his family came from Stratford and lived in the house that we saw there with the carvings. So a very nice change has happened in Stratford this year, and that is that this main street, the High Street, has been closed to traffic during the daytime, and it means that all of the cafes can put tables outside and you can really enjoy it. And it also means that tour guides like me can walk along the middle of the road and film for you to enjoy and get much better views without actually being under the wheels of a bus or a truck. So whoever it was in the Stratford local administration who made that decision, I take my hat off to them. So we're heading along the high street, the commercial centre of the town today, as it has been for 800 years or more. And the road junction as it is now, with Bridge Street on the right leading back down to the river where we began our tour, this would have been the main market area of medieval Stratford, where you would have all of the people coming from the surrounding area, all of the craftsmen working within the town, and they would be coming here to sell their wares on market day. Still, local people producing popular products to share with people in the marketplace. Shakespeare Distillery, it's a local gin distillery founded 6 years ago, to get on board with the very fashionable position of gin as a drink for people these days. And here we're on Bridge Street. Bridge Street is a very wide street. It's a very wide street now. Originally, Bridge Street was 2 streets, front and back Bridge Street, and in the centre of the road there were other houses and shops and market buildings. But in the 18th century, as visitors were coming here, the way they were transporting themselves to their hotels and over long distances was by coach and horses. And coach and horses needs quite a wide area to be able to turn around in. And so as a number of coaching hotels started to open on this particular road, the decision was taken to tear down the buildings in the middle and create one wide road here on Bridge Street, which is why we have this really wide road to this day leading down towards the river. Now, we talk a lot in Stratford about very old events and people from a long time ago. Let's come a little bit more up to date, because these 2 gold post boxes celebrate the achievements of a local man by the name of James Rowe. And James Rowe is a sportsman. He's a rower, and he's blind. He competed at the London 2012 Paralympic Games. And before the Olympics and Paralympics in London in that year, the Royal Mail said that they would make for every British athlete that won a gold medal in the Olympics and the Paralympics, they would create a gold post box in that athlete's hometown. And that's exactly what happened here when James Rowe won gold in the Paralympic rowing, having learnt his sport down there on the River Avon with the local rowing club. So the lovely white building with the clock tower is these days a bank, but it was originally, before the clock tower was added, this was a market hall. So where we have windows on the ground floor today, they would originally have been open archways that led through, and a market hall like that would have provided a place where people who were selling goods like dairy products, meat, things that could not really be left out in direct sunlight, so that's where they would be trading in the market square. So we're onto a pedestrianised area of Henley Street. Leads northwards out of the town centre to the next market town to the north of here, which is called Henley in Arden. So we're back to the Forest of Arden. And on Henley Street is where William Shakespeare was born and grew up. And it's where we're going to be able to see his birthplace, which is still there to this day and open to visitors. It's really a very busy street, not too busy today, but in the summertime this is just the centre for visitors to Stratford, not only because of Shakespeare's birthplace, but because it is absolutely lined with gift shops and tea rooms and coffee shops and places where you can try all kinds of wonderful things, from traditional English tea and cakes to local products like cheese and meat and vegetables and so on. They have an awful lot of beautiful local produce from the rural areas around Stratford. So a lovely half-timbered building here, which is one of the best places to actually get inside a genuine timber frame building 500 years old and have a little look at the wooden beams from the inside without paying, because it's a public library, it's free to go in. It's quite fascinating to see the wood and how old it is and how it's held together with wooden pegs to keep the structure. So here in the centre of Henley Street is one of the newest additions to Stratford's townscape. This is obviously a statue of William Shakespeare. It was sculpted by a man by the name of James Butler, and it was unveiled in 2020. They'd been planning it for several years, and they took advantage of the fact that everything was closed in 2020 to be able to come here without disturbing anybody and set up the new statue of Shakespeare. And the house that you can see to his left, our right, that is in fact his birthplace. So the building, brick built, but that's got a timber frame structure underneath it. This is the Shakespeare gift shop, the main place to buy anything Shakespeare related. It's also the gift shop that is attached to his birthplace. So like a lot of visitor attractions, that's the way you come out if you do visit Shakespeare's birthplace. And here we have the large house, is the house where William Shakespeare was born in 1564, 23rd of April. His father John owned the house. He was a wealthy businessman. He was a leather worker, specialising at that time in the production of beautiful leather gloves, which were very fashionable because we had a queen, Queen Elizabeth I, and one of the things she loved most was beautiful leather gloves. So just like today, you know, what the celebrities wear, what the royal family wear, that's what everybody wanted to wear. And so down to the bottom right of the building here, that is where John Shakespeare had his workshop. He'd been able to sell his goods out of the window. And so he had his business and his family home all in this one large building. Rescued from demolition by public subscription in the 19th century, and ever since then cared for by an organisation called the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, which looks after all the houses related to the Shakespeare family here in and around Stratford. And we have what would once have been the door to the family home with the Shakespeare coat of arms above it. This is a coat of arms that Shakespeare applied for. His father had applied several times for a coat of arms, but he never managed to be successful. But Shakespeare, he had better links and was seen as perhaps more respectable because he was known down in London, and they had links to the royal court through their theatre company, and so he was granted this coat of arms. And it's a pun on his name and his trade, because it is a spear, so Shakespeare, but the point of the spear is the nib of a pen or a quill. So it's a pun on his name and on his trade as a very, very famous writer then and now. So let's take one final look down Henley Street with Shakespeare's birthplace there. So I want to take this opportunity to thank you very much for joining me on this tour today, and thank you as always for the opportunity to collaborate with Free Tours by Foot. It's always a pleasure, and I really enjoy showing you around my part of the world here in central England and sharing Stratford-upon-Avon with you today. Just as a reminder, my name is Ian, IAB Tours, and the links to all of my social media channels and a link you can use if you wish to show your appreciation for this tour, they can all be found in the description box below the video. All I have to say is thank you again, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for watching this video. Thank you for joining me here on Free Tours by Foot. Stay safe, stay happy, happy travelling, and I will see you somewhere out here on the road. From me, goodbye.